Well, who's coming up next? What do we got?
So we've got another panel coming up, and it's going to be led by our good friend Sam Riehn. Sam Riehn is with TMGcore, and I'm going to read his bio real quick. But this is going to be a great conversation amongst some military leaders who are all involved in technology. They're all technologists, et cetera, and can give some further insights in sort of these advanced technologies. They're going to talk about how AI is reshaping the current battlefield and is America prepared. So that's kind of the theme, and I'll let Sam talk to that a little bit. But Sam Riehn is the U.S. Air Force Business Development Lead for TMGcore, a two-phase liquid immersion computing company focusing on HPC, high performance computing, and edge computing. He's also the CEO of Cyber Advisors, so he knows quite a bit about the acquisitions process. He has over 8 years of experience as an Air Force contracting officer working on top secret procurement. So I'd like to welcome Sam to the stage, if you will, to the screen, and thank him for his leadership and his time putting this thing together.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm excited for this next panel. If we have, I have the pleasure to introduce Colonel Diller, Colonel Tucker Hamilton, and Mr. Thom Kenny from SOCOM. And if you guys are all up on comms and video, we have a lot to cover today. I'm so honored to be talking to you as a moderator. And I want to jump right in because we got about 30 minutes, and I want to leave time for questions at the end from the audience. So Colonel Hamilton, we'll jump right in with you. Can you tell us more about what is the MIT Air Force Accelerator, and what are some of the projects that you're tackling out there?
Yeah, absolutely. No, Sam, thank you. It's an honor to be here with you and to be joined with Tom and Nathan, who I have enjoyed our interactions before. Yeah, ultimately, we are the Department of the Air Force and MIT Artificial Intelligence Accelerator. We are in an embedded unit of airmen stationed at MIT working along MIT researchers in order to help shape fundamental research for the public good. And our projects are really fantastic because we engage with the MIT community. We engage with the patriotism of our academic institutions and these people that really want to make an impact. At the same time, we're trying to kind of shift the conversation regarding artificial intelligence inside the DoD. So with our experience with MIT, with our experience with the technology, our airmen then also turn around and they say, we need to create foundational frameworks that are going to empower our airmen and our guardians in the Department of the Air Force in order to be able to employ this powerful tool among many different capabilities that we have. So we're here doing fundamental research, developing partnerships. We're working on policy for the Department of the Air Force, and we have other programs going on where we bring people in, we teach them about AI, we send them back out to their organization, and then the whole time we're alongside these researchers, kind of gleaning from them the newest, greatest algorithm models, way to look at AI, as we also learn to appreciate data and where that kind of plays in this entire ecosystem. So it's been a fantastic partnership. I feel like we're really breaking down silos, and we're trying to do a lot with the 12 airmen that are assigned here, and we're really the solely dedicated AI unit for the Department of the Air Force. So it's been an honor to help establish this and see it become very fruitful.
That's awesome. Thank you. I didn't know that you were just a small group of 12 people, because you've made a big impact. Definitely one of the more forward-leaning in this space for the Air Force and AI. So we know that AI is changing the character of war. Can you talk about how you guys are thinking about that? And then also, are you addressing autonomy? How do you view those as different on the battlefield?
Yeah, Sam, do you want me to jump in on that one, or?
Yep, sorry, still with you, Colonel Hamilton.
Okay, no, absolutely. Okay, so I will start by saying that I think the most important thing we can do regarding artificial intelligence as a DoD is our responsible AI approach, right? Like, we have a responsibility to our society to ensure that we, no kidding, are creating a space where ethical AI is kind of at the center of all the work that we're doing. Because I'll tell you, artificial intelligence, like a lot of software and like other technologies, capabilities, can really have a negative side effect too, right? And we need to ensure that we have the right approach for it. So for us, the first thing I think about, AI using it anyway, especially on the battlefield, is like, are we adhering to and talking about in all of our like development discussions, the 5 principles of ethical AI, which the DoD talks about as, explainable AI, reliable, equitable, traceable, and governable. And I think it's actually super important for our conversation for me to break those down just really quickly. So in the way that we define it, responsible AI is DoD personnel exercising appropriate levels of judgment and care while remaining responsible for the development, deployment, and use of that AI capability, AI-powered capability. I think of AI as like electricity that powers other things. Equitable AI. So the department is going to take deliberate steps to minimize unintended bias. And there is always bias with our data. So how do we minimize that? Traceable. So the department's AI capabilities will need to be developed and deployed, that we have personnel with appropriate understanding of the technology, with the process behind the technology, with the operational methods applicable to the capabilities. Are we transparent? Things like that. Reliable AI. So the department's capabilities will have to be well-defined use cases, safety, security, effectiveness needs to be a part of the conversation. How do we test it? How do we have assurance for it? And how do we deal with it across the entire life cycle? And mind you, once again, life cycle of a system that's powered by AI, because AI is really ubiquitous and is going to power everything. And the last thing is governable. So the department needs to design and engineer capabilities that are appropriately used, right? So they have intended functions, and that we can avoid unintended consequences, and we have an ability to deactivate anything AI. So I need that. We all need that framework. If we talk about AI in the battlefield and what we're doing. So that kind of like, there's a lot of things that I'm sure going to get into now, but I want everyone to be aware that that is the DoD's, that's our priority when we're, discussing developing AI capability.
Awesome. One more question for you, Colonel Hamilton. How can industry or small business or the AI, even researchers listening to us today, how do they engage with the MIT Air Force's AI Accelerator? And what are you doing to transition your projects out of the accelerator into real Air Force, if you will?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sam. I forgot about your autonomy and AI question too. So let me get back to that after I answer the question you just posed. So we engage with industry very limited right now, but the best way is to go onto our website, which is aia.mit.edu. We can throw that in the chat, aia.mit.edu. We have challenge problems. So we have curated data that is releasable, and we get people engaged with trying to solve these problems for us. That's a great way to connect in with us to see what we're doing. It also is a good way for us to kind of have a awareness of what industry is up to, because our technology, we're doing fundamental research, and we've only been around for 2 years. Like, we started January of 2020, so just over. We're hoping to get our technology to a place where we are taking pieces of it and we're transitioning that into program offices, which then is going to require industry to be able to sustain some of the work that we're doing. So I'd say the research is the best way. Our challenge problems. So go onto our website and you can look under, I think it says challenges, and you can see how to engage as industry partners in that way. And then I think there's going to be more things that we're doing coming up soon that people could actually get engaged with our research projects. So we're doing all that framework stuff. We also have the research projects, and we want industry engaged with that. Okay, break. Let me answer to, because it's super important. AI is not autonomy. AI is not robotics, right? Like, AI is typically used in very narrow use cases where there's a lot of data, there's compute power to solve it, there's predictable outcomes so that you can use data to do what it does best, which is kind of crunch the numbers, see things that humans can't see, but we need to use humans, for where they're needed most. And then we need to think about, the teaming that AI and humans can create, which is very powerful. But back to autonomy. Yeah, autonomous systems can be AI, right? But I think it's important for us to be deliberate with our language and know that AI is not necessarily autonomy. AI can be a lot of different things, from misinformation, disinformation campaigns to helping you select the next movie you're going to watch on Netflix, or helping a marketer target, someone more appropriately. And autonomy is also extremely important and can be powered by AI. And that's where people think like, oh, well, killer robots on the battlefield, that making decisions of lethality. Like, we're not at a point in the DoD or even as a society to go down that path. What we need is our autonomous systems that are run effectively, that have their own assurances, that are safe, AI systems, and making sure that we have control over those AI powered capabilities, so that a human is always in like the loop, and not just the loop, right? The human is making the decision on anything regarding lethality. So I think it's good for people to know that they're not the same thing. All right. Any follow-ons, Sam, to that?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to use that to transition to Colonel Diller, sir, as the director of AFWERX. Challenges is something we hear, and we're synonymous with AFWERX. So how is AFWERX initiatives of engaging industry different from the AI accelerators?
Absolutely. So, I think what Cinco just described at MIT, really establishing the foundation for AI in our departments, so that, this is a buzzword that can be sprinkled anywhere. When you go and look at the great work that Cinco's done up at MIT, right, there's really a level of depth there. So we're building, right, and that's key to having internal to our Air Force an understanding of what is this, how do I establish nomenclatures and an understanding for distinctions in things like autonomy and like AI. And so that really provides, I think, a lot of the really good intellectual foundation for us. We get a bit more into the tactical, how do we establish contracts, in particular with companies and with industry. So with academia. So we have two key mechanisms for being that open front door. So AFWERX moved a bit more into a capability development program, really started very much focusing on culture, creating partnerships with academia, with non-traditional companies. And then over the last 18 months, more of a focus on this capability development. We have a budget of about $1 billion between small business funding and then funding for our prime programs that I'll talk to here in just a moment. And so the idea is, how do we become that better partner? If indeed you believe that the private sector, there's 80% of research and development is happening in the commercial sector, how do we make sure going forward that we as the Department of the Air Force have access to those phenomenal technologies that are happening in many cases in the startup community from the small businesses? And our approach to that has been our Air Force Ventures program under AFWERX that creates, typically on 3 cycles a year, solicitations, either a phase 1 where it could be a small business innovation research. Those typically we have around a $50,000, maybe $100,000 value. We also just closed a solicitation for one of our space programs. So AFWERX is one part of the Air Force Research Laboratory, one lab supporting 2 services. And so the director of SpaceWorks is deputy director in AFWERX, and that's something that could swap back and forth into the future. But this small business technology transfer program was a recent way where very closely we partner with research institutions and small businesses for what is typically a 3 to 6 month period of performance on a contract, a relatively low barrier to entry. These were $250,000 contracts. In the phase 1, those eventually, we award about 1,000 of those a year. We then award about 300 phase 2, which are prototype contracts. And then we look to award about 20, what we call StratFi. And this is cases where we've been able to scale within a year from a $50,000 contract to a $40 million contract, working to move at the pace of emerging technologies. We do this in conjunction with AF Ventures. Works closely with our Spark division, which is the touch point with our operators that are out there using these technologies. So that technology combined with that concept of operation then goes into our third piece, which is how do we move this across the valley of death, right? This idea of all the things associated with funding, with contracting, with training, with test and evaluation. And so we've got 2 prime programs that have been started. One is Agility Prime. This is the electrification of aviation through vertical takeoff and landing. That was our first prime program. The second one is with our orbital prime program, a program looking to reduce orbital debris in space. And so those become then the pathways of bringing in a very low barrier to entry, new partnerships. We've had over 1,800 companies go down that path. Of those, 70% are new, and our largest portfolio in all of that is in artificial intelligence. And so there's work that we'll be doing in actually some of our prime programs where we're taking those artificial intelligence technologies, we're scaling them. Several of those AI companies have gone on recently to get those fall in StratFi, right? These are $30 to $60 million contracts. And so being able to scale those, but really it's super important that we first have that foundation and those touch points that Cinco has established there with the MIT Accelerator. So we think we have a good framework, much more to learn and much more to do, but the idea is expanding and accelerating that technology development and turning it into operational capability.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question out of the chat here. I keep hearing TACFI and StratFi or something that effect. Can you please share what those are and go into a little more depth with those?
Absolutely. So when we start with these $50,000 contracts, what we're trying to do is we're not funding necessarily a company, but really funding a project, funding the team and building that team right from the outset. And that team certainly includes our collaboration with industry and academia. We also work internally, making sure that we've got an operator who knows how to use it. We've got a technologist that can validate the technical merit of the project. And then we've got some type of an acquisition entity that can provide all the necessary nuts and bolts to bring it across that valley of death, to turn an idea into an operational capability. So we start that with the phase one, but eventually, our intent is to be able to scale at a way that really meets the responsiveness of these emerging technology companies. And so TACFI and StratFi, our approach of doing that. And we look at that team as we build it out into the StratFi program. So this is the ability to take up to $15 million of small business funding, matched with another $15 million across the government, right? We want someone else to have skin in the game, matched with then potentially private capital. And so that could be $50 million of small business funding, $15 million of government funding, and then another $30 million of other investment capital from the private sector. Building that team so that we see together, we are collectively reducing that risk, but doing it in a very rapid way that develops these dual use technologies, great things that are important for our military operational capability, but we think also key in ensuring we keep a technical competitive advantage to grow our nation's economy. And you can learn more about, if you go to AFWERX.com, you'll find a lot of additional information there. That's where we typically post our upcoming solicitations. We actually right now growing the team. We're about 100 folks in AFWERX right now, looking to hire another 50 in the March timeframe. That solicitation's open. If you want to join an exciting team, partnering with folks like Cinco, with these other companies, go to AFWERX.com and see more there as well.
Yes, thank you, and congrats on the first ever, SpaceWorks STTR program and it being a space prime. We're excited about that. Went off without a hitch, so that's awesome, and looking forward to see the results there. Are you looking ahead at future prime, initiatives, and would AI maybe be one of them?
So we definitely have looked at some of the future prime. And this goes a little bit back to what Cinco talked about, this distinction between autonomy and AI. Now, there's an interesting challenge that I don't know that we have fully captured is how do we commercialize artificial intelligence? How do you commercialize algorithms? Certainly, autonomy is one way of doing that. Business practices, certainly. So we've looked at an autonomous / AI prime, again, with the guidance of our friends there at the AI Accelerator, making sure that we're making those distinctions in the technologies that we're bringing in. Now, we looked at things like energy and different approaches to bring operational energy forward. We've looked at different approaches to digital engineering and digital design. We think very important there. Microelectronics has been another area. When we look at these primes, we look in particular, is there alignment between an existing or an emerging industry? Is there backing by the private sector from an investment perspective? Is there international interest? Many of these, because they're dual use technologies, a lot of interagency arrangements that have been established. We have agreements with FAA, with NASA, certainly you can imagine with the Department of Energy. So the interagency piece is very important with dual use. And then again, back to our technologists in the lab, our engineers, our program managers, and then the operator to look at those future primes. So looking forward to potentially announcing more of those with this coming year.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kenney, as the Chief Data Officer of Special Operations, AI and in SOCOM, you're probably closer to the problem than anyone. And so what we've kind of talked about is research, and we talked about acquisition a little bit. What about adoption? And can you talk to me a little bit about what SOCOM is doing as far as AI?
Thanks, Sam, and appreciate the opportunity to speak here. It's great with this panel to talk about some of this stuff, because the more we communicate with industry, the more we communicate with our friends across the DoD, the faster we're going to get to the point that we see ourselves. But to your question about adoption, one of the things that SOCOM is really, really good at is being very agile, being very nimble. Our SEAL teams, our Green Beret teams, our pararescuemen, all of our enablers that support them, we move very, very quickly. And we move quickly at trouble as quickly as we move to look for solutions. And one of the things that's interesting is as we think about 3 buckets of where we need to be from a command perspective, it goes back to a tried and true management practice that Covey started, which was mindset, tool set, and skill set. The tool set's out there. Some of it is great. Some of it is going to be great. Some of it is not so great. We kind of evaluate those tool sets and how we can use them. The skill sets are going to take a lot longer for us to be able to develop internally. Cinco's doing some great work with a small team, but I would argue that we need 10 times the number of people, maybe even more, working on problems like this, because this is an existential problem for us as a Department of Defense and as a nation. But the most important part of that, and one of the things that we concentrate a lot on at SOCOM, is the mindset. And the mindset means thinking about things very, very differently about how we're going to adopt new technologies. The pace and acceleration of what technologies are capable of doing, we need our people, and especially our leaders, to keep pace with that. Cinco did a really good job talking about automation is not AI. But one of the really great things that we've tried to educate our force here is that automation can really be a great foundation. Because to do automation well, you have to understand your data, you have to understand where it's coming from, and you have to understand what you want to output. Now, it's interesting how we look at that from a very sequential aspect. And to say that it's not AI is absolutely true, but we do get some folks wrapped around the axle sometimes thinking automation is AI. So getting that mindset for people to be open-minded about where we're going is really important. The adoption of artificial intelligence is really, really important in special operations to link it to the operator. So I'm going to tie back something that we think is really important to get these types of technologies into the hands of our operators, who are great validators or provers of not worth for some of our industry tools that we use, because we're going through so many things so often. But if we look at the 5 ethical aspects of AI, the one area that isn't explicitly called out, but we think is one of the most important aspects of AI and adoption, is explainability. We know traceability. We can see how something actually happened along the lines, and we can think about whether or not it's an ethical thing that we've built. And we can talk to the engineers that built it and the man in the middle or the woman in the middle who's a part of the ecosystem for those AI decisions. But if we take a look at a 5 whys scenario, the who, what, when, where, and why, in that, or the 5 W's, in that type of scenario, in AI algorithm, we can know who executed it, where did it execute, all of those except for the why. And one of the things we're really pushing that our operators are driving us to is the why can't be, why did the engineer code the algorithm the way it did? That's just one small part of the solution. For us to really get to adoption, our operators need to trust these AI algorithms and trust them in a humanistic way instead of a technological way. And what I mean by that is if you think about how we're actually going through and developing AI applications, a lot of folks are thinking about AI as another technology, another sequence of events, a smarter automation. When in reality, what it is we're trying to create is the ability for a technology to make a decision. And that decision, when we think about a SEAL team or an ODA team, and something doesn't go quite right, we go to that team and we look at what were those decisions along the way. And we ask the question about why did you make those decisions along the way? Because that helps us improve and it helps us gain greater trust with our teams and with our systems and our tools. You wouldn't expect a SEAL team leader to go out onto a mission, have something maybe not go the way they want, and go all the way back to Navy Special Warfare school and ask the instructors, why did you teach that SEAL platoon commander to do that? That's exactly what we're thinking about doing from an AI perspective, is we're going back to the engineers and we're saying, why did you engineer it that way? Which is just like saying, why did you train someone that way? So adoption for us, that explainability where we can say, not just what happened, but why did the algorithm choose that particular output, is how we're going to gain trust with our folks that are in the field, especially at the tactical edge where they're operating in denied or very disrupted communication environments where they may need to rely on the artificially intelligent agents that they deploy with only 12 folks or maybe even 6 folks that are doing a mission. So that explainability is really, really important for us inside of the mindset and how we work with industry, which aligns with how industry is working as well. If you think about any large enterprise, think about Intel's assembly line for chips. If the chip line breaks down and now there's a supply chain shortage or there's an issue with getting that back up and running, you're not asking the folks that are on the line, why did someone train you to do that the wrong way? That may be one of the questions, but you also want to be able to explain all the steps that cause that. So even industry is starting to look from an AI perspective really closely at that explainability.
Thank you, sir. You touched on 2 things that I wanted to dig a little deeper on there. So, I love that you mentioned tactical edge, and kind of on the commercial space, we're seeing everyone who moved to the cloud a couple of years ago now trying to move out of the cloud and back out to the edge. And for SOCOM, that edge is very different from others. You mentioned denied and disruptive. So how, a couple things that you need, how are you addressing compute at a austere environment location? How are you addressing power, and how are you addressing cooling in those kinds of not friendly environments?
One of the first things we look at is what is the difference between executing an algorithm and the actual learning of the algorithm. If you think about full motion video object detection, training a model is very, very difficult to do. That's something that takes a lot of compute and storage space to be able to get a really reliable model. But when you deliver that model to the edge, you don't necessarily need the same compute power and storage power to execute that particular algorithm. And a really great example is a company that we met in Austin about 2 years ago. And they took a 20-year-old analog software dissertation and turned it into a capability in the digital space where they're using analog computing to do digital execution of machine learning algorithms on devices that are the size of your SIM card and using less than 1 watt of power. And they also built it in a way where you can piece together, like Lego blocks, a number of different pieces of hardware that are all light, that are all super low power, but that are purpose-driven for specific types of machine learning algorithms. Another example is when you're talking about natural language processing. When you think about the billions, or in some cases, the trillions of features that you need to train a natural language processing algorithm, for say a generative transformative algorithm for text, that you're generating new text from a corpus, as one example, Cinco had mentioned the IO space, you don't necessarily need all that same compute power to execute that algorithm. You really need it to train it. So we differentiate those 2 things very, very quickly. But to your point, one of the biggest questions that we are asking is, a lot of people hear minimally viable product. Well, what's the minimally viable capability that we can put in a backpack for somebody that's going forward, or in a small boat craft for someone that's going forward, so that they can execute? And by separating those two things, and going back to the mindset discussion, we're helping folks realize that you don't necessarily need Amazon Web Services to follow you out to the tactical edge. What you need are, what are those core machine learning algorithms? What's the power, compute, and storage space that they need to execute? Now, there is a little bit of an Achilles heel, though. As we think about World War II, we were producing P-51s as quickly as we could. And we didn't have enough to really sway the battle. But we knew the Germans would always look at the spinners and the tails of aircraft to determine how many squadrons are the Americans actually fielding. So in a little bit of disinformation campaign, the spinners and the tails were painted differently, even in the same squadron, to give the illusion that there were more aircraft than there actually were. It was a great technique. In the context of only sending out the capability to execute a machine learning algorithm, the Achilles heel is we may find something new that we may not be able to train. So as we think about that, now we're talking about what are those satellite-based or terrestrial-based communication systems that can provide the bandwidth that we need, that even if we can't do it at the tactical edge when we're in black silence for communication, but we're at least close enough that we can feed the algorithm back some new information, have it run that in the background, and then download it. So that's kind of the very, very tricky balance that we're trying to manage from a tactical execution perspective.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing you mentioned is supply chain. And I think future war in today's battlefield, data is just as important as water and ammunition was in prior battlefields. So how are you thinking about collection and storing this data and the supply chain of the data?
I would say from a supply chain for the data perspective, we have to look at it a number of different ways. The first is there are always going to be those collections that are happening that require the high bandwidth, high storage capability. Thinking about any sort of high resolution videography or photography that happens either in aerospace or in space, where you're going to need that kind of compute and storage. We also think about the future of pub/sub models with IoT and all of the devices that seem to be pervasive now inside of the DoD, which can all talk to each other. How do we manage those channels of that supply chain? But as we think about supply chain disruption, which I think is what you're getting at with your talking point, there's a lot of work that we're thinking about in terms of how can we provide inference on data such that we can compress data streams even more than maybe we're doing today, and compress those streams in a secure way enough that we get exactly the right amount of data that we need to the teams. Historically, if you think about the last 20 years, we didn't really differentiate the data that we were sending forward. If you were a brigade or you were an Air Force squadron and you were deployed in Afghanistan or you were deployed in Iraq, you pretty much had the same pipe to the same systems and all the data was coming in. And maybe it wasn't the fastest pipe, but you didn't really pick and choose what data you wanted to come through those pipes. We think that's going to be even more important. And we think as we look to some of the technologies like pub/sub, that really helps that. You put ownership in the hands of the teams that need it, that can pick and choose the data that they need, highly compress it, leverage inference, and then we create an opportunity where we're being much more specific about the data that we want, the data that we need, so that when we are in constrained environments where we may not have the bandwidth we need, we've still got the ability to communicate with our team.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad we got everyone on the call today, because then now we can start to solve some of these problems. Colonel Hamilton can research how we get AI in a backpack, and then Colonel Diller can go and procure those prototypes.
Yeah, Sam, do you mind if I jump in real quick?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, I really appreciate the comments from Thom, and I think that it is important for well, one, I'll share that we are trying to tackle some of that with our projects. AI on the edge is something that one of our projects is looking at, as well as using data and AI in austere environments. But ultimately, I think of it as data, compute, and algorithms, when we think about AI. And I think that for our industry folks that are on the line, data is super important. It actually speaks to that supply chain question that you just had. Ultimately, we need to standardize data. We need data coming off of systems that industry partners are developing for us that's in a format that's machine ready, right? And we as a government need to start demanding that as part of a contractual requirement, right? Like if you want to go under contract with the government, you're going to supply us data. That data is going to be in a format that is going to allow us basically a smooth transition to use it in AI capability. So I think that that is important. If I were an industry partner, I would be really looking at like what kind of data is coming off of my systems and how do I make that machine ready so that when the government comes knocking, which is going to be soon, and saying, okay, I want to go under contract with you, you could say, okay, great. And by the way, we also have this machine ready. So that's a piece of it that is super important. The compute is a little bit more difficult because computers in the government, it's hard to necessarily procure and be on the leading edge with some of it. And so that's a challenge that we have. Computers are not doubling in their capacity or their power every 2 years anymore. Like Moore's law is somewhat dead in that regard. And so I think as a government, we need to make sure that we are procuring the right systems, and those can be used on the edge too. But the key that I've recognized is AI is a science, right? And the research that's going on specifically here at MIT has really kind of blown me away in the sense that the algorithm development is changing the compute necessity. So before you needed a large supercomputer to run certain things, but we're coming up with new things called, well, for an example, one is called neural circuit policies, which are mind-blowing, amazing, like ways of taking deep neural networks and having that same outcome that used to take 500,000 nodes, now down to 19 nodes, right? Which now doesn't require the same type of compute power that was required earlier, right? So there's a science too that we as a DoD need to be agile to adopt into our systems. As things get better, we need to have that capability, because what that is going to drive is then AI on the edge. No kidding, UAVs with computer vision systems flying around now that can actually do computer vision work because it's running a AI powered capability that no longer requires a supercomputer backend. So all of these things, the data, the compute, and the algorithms kind of tie in together to allow us to be most efficient, effective, and to tackle the battle space of the future.
I like that you mentioned Moore's law, and I think I agree it's slowing down, but it's not because of the compute, it's because of the cooling. We're reaching a point where it's just impossible to cool compute efficient enough with air. And so I'd love to talk to you, circle with you later about how TMGcore's liquid cooling system is making, it's bringing Moore's law back and making that more possible. Okay. One last thing, Colonel Diller, this is over to you, sir. We've talked about industry partners and how they can engage, but a lot of the industry partners in AI and ML aren't our small businesses. They have majority-owned venture capital, backing, or they're non-traditional. They might have 501 employees, but not a lot of business with DoD. How are you looking at addressing that?
Sure. So great question. One, there's some alternatives for majority-owned VC that we're taking advantage. Again, SBA has been great in exploring all our alternatives. So hopefully I get one of a few down. If we end up moving this more towards one of the prime, our AFWERX prime paradigms like Orbital Prime or like Agility Prime. With both of those programs, we've been very deliberate in having an approach to OTs, for example, that ensure that there's an opportunity for both big and small businesses that are there, as well as the funding that is there as well. So, at present, largely it's come from some of the funding is come from the small businesses, but as we look at the potential of launching this in a bit more of a formal way, in this particular vein, we'll make sure that, again, as we've done with Orbital Prime and with Agility Prime, that we leave that open as an opportunity there. And then, we're certainly not the only folks around that are doing this type of work. And so no lack of activities in other parts of the services. And we stay pretty well tied into those. So if somebody has a fantastic idea to bring forward that maybe is from a larger defense prime or one of these mid-tier companies, still reach out to us because we've been successful in making that connective point many times. Sam, I think you're muted.
You're on mute.
Thank you. I know we have about 2 minutes left before we'll see the team jump back on here. So any final parting thoughts you'd like to put out there?
So I'll just add one, and it ties into, I think, what both of the other panelists are talking about with getting to work with non-traditional companies. It's something we want to be able to do. Having data that's accessible is key. And sometimes a smaller company that's brand new, that's got a new idea, has a lot more flexibility than sometimes a larger company. And I don't mean that as a disparagement to larger companies, just as an encouragement to younger companies. If you've got ideas and you want to come to the industry, we're doing things at SOCOM to completely transform our acquisition process so that we can work with companies more quickly. And then we're also doing some really interesting work with the larger primes to really get after, the huge data sets that we need from an algorithmic perspective. How do we share that data? How do we truly make it interoperable? And to one of the other points, this is how we get to what we want to be when we grow up. The ability for multiple UAVs, ground-based forces, sea-based forces, space-based forces, air-based forces are all communicating seamlessly together. And we all have that picture. That's been something that we've had as an advantage for a while. We can maintain and even accelerate that advantage in the future, thinking very creatively about how we get after some of these challenges.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Colonel Hamilton, Colonel Diller, anything to add? Okay, I've got one more question, sir, Mr. Kenney, along those lines. I'm actually pulling it out of the chat here. We just talked about, how, a barrier might be they're majority VC owned or they have one too many employees. What about foreign companies? And I know that's a touchy subject when it comes to, DoD data, but are you looking to enable a lot of the talent from foreign businesses that might want to work with the DoD?
I'll be blunt and say this is not my area of expertise. The data point that I would add is that we do want to be very conscious of our partners, our foreign partners that we work with every day, to ensure that we've got the right kinds of systems that can interoperate and communicate with data. But I'll respectfully decline to answer, as that part of acquisition is not my specialty. I want to make sure I don't misspeak.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick, Sam. I've been a part of an Army program where they are specifically looking at foreign technologies in the AI space. And I was a part of like a judging panel out in London this past summer. It was really, really tough. But we went out there and we listened to the finalists basically pitch some of their AI ideas. So there are ways of getting engaged. I'm trying to think of what that program is, but it was an Army program that is doing exactly that.
Thank you.
We've had some success on in space pitch days, for example, international space pitch days. So that industrial, when we look at the industrial base, we certainly look at that of our partners as being part of it. Obviously, as Thom mentioned, a bit more complex, but certainly an area where that increased collaboration is a key interest item for us. We recently stood up another international division to put more emphasis on that in particular.
Thank you. And then probably final question here as we're waiting for the panel to come back here. I really like this question in the chat. Thank you, Deborah, for asking this. So Colonel Diller, while you're still off mute, the question is, AFWERX calls itself an open front door. Do companies still need to hire retired military officers or consultants to help them understand potential military applications for their technology? So I think that the question more broadly is, and it's why or why not, but I think it is, what is everyone doing for outreach? How does industry engage with you and discover some of the problems in their use cases?
Absolutely. And so we've been very deliberate. There was a series of memos pushed out by our general counsel 4 years ago, talking about myths. And it was really to encourage that openness and dialogue with industry. One of the things that makes AFWERX able to do that very quickly is this low barrier to entry for these small phase one companies. And so we hold every month, the last Wednesday of every month, collider events where industry can interact directly with the operators to understand what the different pain points are for the operators that are out there. When they get onboarded then as a phase one company, the direct connectivity that eventually allows them to move forward into that phase 1 or phase 2. Right. And then the other idea that, sometimes fresh ideas that, maybe have never touched the military might be some of the most innovative ideas that are out there, and really start to break down some of the paradigms that we are looking to do as we look to accelerate change. So certainly welcome that breadth of ideas in a variety of different ways here in AFWERX.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation. David, sir, over to you. I see you online.
Well, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Yep, great stuff, Sam. Thank you, and certainly to your trifecta of interviewees, we can't thank you enough. This is America's Future Series National Security Dual Use Technology Summit. We're going to be here for the better part of the day, and we're delighted to welcome you, wherever you might be from. My name is Scott Murray. This is David Hamilton. He is the creator, the founder of the America's Future Series, and of course, day to day handles the CEO chores. So thus far, what do you think, my friend?
That's
You
fantastic.
pleased?
Well, I'm very encouraged by that conversation, because they enumerated a number of efforts they're making to leave no stone unturned to find the most innovative solutions providers, the best solutions for our warfighters, whether it's working outside the United States, but internationally, finding the small guys, working with the big guys to move things along faster, or maybe pairing the two together, et cetera. So I'm very, very keen to, it was very heartening to hear that. We've been talking about this for a long time. It seems to be really happening. Changes are being made, cultures are being changed, processes are being changed, and therefore it's incredibly promising how we're going to be able to bring out innovation, better technologies faster.
Right. Yeah, no, I totally agree.